Good morning. Can you all hear me okay? All right, wonderful. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. This was a really exciting opportunity to take a different approach to work I've been doing for a few years now, where I get to take a transnational perspective on environmental information. And I'll say that preparing this keynote sent me into many rabbit holes of Canadian environmental history and policy that I really had not expected to go down. I have no doubt that I have missed something, so I've made sure that I've included plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So I hope that you will let me know anything that I have inevitably overlooked. But I want to start by going back to 1953. On the evening of August 15th, 1953, a group of people gathered at the shore of one of the world's largest lakes, and they had a champagne toast from a set of bleachers. It was within view of the future site of the Mackinac Bridge, which would become one of the world's longest suspension bridges that would connect Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas after decades of ferry service. Now, the people toasting with champagne from the bleachers weren't there because they had any connection to the bridge, but because they were there to greet the arrival of the first section of a twin pipeline that had just been placed underneath a 4-mile channel of water at depths of up to 250 feet. And the arrival of the North 30 twin pipelines marked one of the deepest water crossings in pipeline history up to that time. But aside from a few mentions in industry journals and Michigan's legislative record, no one really paid attention to these pipelines, and it stayed that way for about the next 60 years. So I am aware that most of you probably don't engage with environmental information on a regular basis. Maybe you check the weather report on your way out the door when you go to work to figure out whether to bring an umbrella, or in the case of the weather right now, a very warm coat to work. You're probably at a library technology conference because part of your job description involves using specialized technologies to connect your users with the information that your library has. But even if it's not present within your daily working life, you encounter environmental information all the time even if you don't realize it. So when you brush your teeth in the morning, the water that comes out of your taps is part of a larger infrastructure for which there's tons of information. The food that you're eating, the air quality of the park that you might visit this weekend, or the roads that you drive on every day are part of larger infrastructure that all have lots of information that you may never see or handle. But perhaps the infrastructure that most deeply shapes every continuous hour of our lives is the one that we share right now as we sit beneath these lights and in this very climate-controlled room that is powered by the infrastructure of energy production. And the vast majority of energy used in the world today, about 80% of it, comes from the production of fossil fuels. And fossil fuels occupy this particularly challenging position with infrastructure and information. They're removed from the earth. They are often transported long distances where then they undergo further refining, and then they maybe travel quite a bit more until they get to the point of use. So this requires a lot of worldwide infrastructure to support the movement of these products. And for any infrastructure to work efficiently, it requires a lot of information so that people know where the products are coming and going. So why should those of you who are here today care about the data of infrastructure outside of your institutions? Because you don't have any control over it, right? And why especially should you care about the information associated with fossil fuels, which probably has nothing to do with your job description? Well, I'd like to argue it's because librarians and archivists are unique among the professions in that we understand how the use of information and the lack of access to it impacts the communities that we live and work in. Fossil fuel interests in the United States and Canada benefit enormously from a legal framework that allows them to shelter tons of information from the public. And this has serious consequences both in the short term for people who live near the infrastructure of production and transportation, but also in the long term for everyone who's alive today and tomorrow that will have to deal with the effects of climate change caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So some of you may have heard a figure that different studies have produced showing that a fairly small number of companies are responsible for most of the historical emissions that have ever been produced. And these numbers change depending on the methodologies, the time span you're looking at. But I want you to think about this in the context of your job. What would happen if someone came into your library and they wanted information on the US or Canadian companies that are on this list? What would you be able to share with them? You might be able to share some annual reports that they share with stockholders. Maybe you could find some information that they have shared with energy regulators. But what if that patron wanted to know, well, what are they talking about on the board? Where are they going to drill next? And the reality is that you would quickly hit a brick wall. You would not be able to get a lot of that information that your patron might want because so much of it is locked up within the private sector that is responsible for the production of fossil fuels. So this puts us in a position where with one of the largest issues facing the global community, we librarians and archivists do not have the means to help others access information about this. And not only is this information not within our libraries, often it's not even within the public domain. Fossil fuel infrastructure has another challenge associated with it. Unlike the roads that we travel on every day, it's hidden. Most pipelines are underground, and this is actually for pretty good reason. If you have a lot of pipelines that are above ground, then this can cause, they are more exposed to the elements. Something could hit them, they could rupture. But the consequence of having so much of our fossil fuel infrastructure hidden is that we don't think about what we cannot see. And so when we can't encounter this infrastructure in our daily lives, when it's less visible to us because it's not like a road that we travel on every day and we think, oh gosh, there's potholes around, but we don't think about the pipeline that might be a few miles from our house, the only thing that we have to sort of understand that infrastructure is documentation and information. And because most pipelines are hidden in the landscape, then what we have to do to see them is to look at maps. And the way that the United States and Canada presents information about pipelines in their national maps is very fascinating and very telling. So when you start on the Canadian pipeline map, you get this disclaimer, you agree, and then you're immediately taken to a national view. And this is from the Federal Regulator of Pipelines in Canada. And from this, you can get some pretty useful information on the left-hand side. You can get length and if there's been any major industrial accidents along these pipelines. But from here, you can enter an address, you can zoom in down to different areas, and so on and so forth. Let's compare this to the United States. So you get this really stern red language that says you can't zoom very close, and that is because of some national security concerns. What's interesting about this is actually the same restrictions that exist in the Canadian map, but what I really appreciate about the Canadian map is that it's not insinuating that I'm up to no good just because I want to understand where hidden infrastructure is around me. So once you say, okay, yeah, I'm not going to do anything bad with this, if you notice there's something interesting in the lower left-hand corner here. This says, tell us what state and county you're interested in. And this is the first clue that this map isn't really designed to be useful. For context, I live in the state of Ohio. Ohio has 88 counties, and I can only name maybe about half a dozen of them. So I can't view more than one county at a time. Now, in her talk, Ursula Franklin, who was a University of Toronto professor, she gave a talk titled "The Tool Shapes the Task." And this has been a really formative talk that she gave on my own thinking, and she talks about how the tools that we use to do different types of work really shape our sense of the possibility and really shape the way in which we do this work. So when the US map forces us to consider a pipeline only within the boundaries of a pretty small political jurisdiction, it doesn't allow me to say, look at, well, what's the landscape of pipelines between Cincinnati, where I live, and Cleveland, which is a couple hundred miles away. Now, these local examples, so this is the US map here on the left and the Canadian map on the right, they're showing the same area, Detroit and Windsor. And it shows you, it doesn't even acknowledge the fact that pipelines are often transnational infrastructure. So the pipelines sort of stop in the middle of the Detroit River. And this is also a problem because we know not only do pipelines cross national political jurisdictions, but they also cross major transnational watersheds, like the Great Lakes. So of course, the Great Lakes, 5 major interconnected lakes. They're about 750 miles or 1,200 kilometers. A lot of people, a lot of scientists do not call them lakes. They call them inland seas. And this makes sense if you are on a large lake like Lake Michigan, because you'll often see waves coming off the water. They contain roughly 21% of the world's fresh water and 84% of North American fresh water. And I would really love to see a show of hands. How many of you live in this basin? Okay. So enjoy that feeling of water security, because we're gonna all be very grateful for it down the road. So 1/4 of Canadian agricultural production takes place within this watershed. 10% of the US population lives within it, and 30% of Canadian population lives in this area. They provide the cities a lot of shipping routes, water for manufacturing, but they have also historically been convenient places to discharge pollution. Some of you might be familiar with one of the most infamous milestones in US environmental history, which is when the Cuyahoga River, which feeds into Lake Erie, caught on fire multiple times. But this year was the 50th anniversary of the last time that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. And this led to a lot of really interesting environmental laws that were passed, and it went quite a long way towards cleaning up the Great Lakes. Yet, we still have this very persistent threat of serious pollution around the Great Lakes, and this is the pipelines that exist around them. So the pipelines around the Great Lakes are directly linked with the history of oil production in Alberta. The Lakehead pipeline system around the Great Lakes started being built in the 1950s by a company called Provincial Pipeline, and this was the predecessor company of Enbridge. Now, this pipeline system was designed to transport crude oil that was being produced in Alberta's newly discovered Leduc oil fields. And the first phase of the pipeline went from Alberta to Superior, Wisconsin, which is at the western edge of the lakes. What would happen then is they would take the oil that arrived in Superior, put it on ships, and then ship it over to Sarnia, Ontario, where then it would be further refined. But so much oil was starting to be produced in Alberta, and there was also this really inconvenient fact that the Great Lakes would ice over in the winter, that they thought, you know what, we got to build a pipeline to move more of this product over to Ontario. So Interprovincial Pipeline considered 2 routes, and the first one would have gone around Chicago, so around the southern edge of Lake Michigan, and then up to Sarnia. But they considered another route, which would have been one that went through Michigan's Upper Peninsula, through the Straits of Mackinac, through the Lower Peninsula, which is the mitten shape, and then over Detroit to, well, rather, a little bit further up the Detroit River to Sarnia. Now, you might be asking yourself, did the company ever consider just building it entirely through Canada? And it never really did, because it would have cost $10 million more and added an extra 120 miles of pipeline. So the company decided on the second option through the Straits of Mackinac, which is in this little red circle here. And this all took place in the 1950s. So this was well before the United States had any modern environmental laws that would require you to do an environmental impact assessment to see, hey, like, could something bad happen if we do this? And because there were so few laws about environmental assessment of major engineering projects, this whole thing was very quick. It started in 1952, and it was in production, so oil was flowing through the system by 1954. The routing of the pipelines through the Straits of Mackinac has turned this pipeline into one of the most contested pieces of aging fossil fuel infrastructure in the United States today. In large part, this is due to its location in the Straits of Mackinac. So this connects Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and at its widest point, it's about 5 miles wide. But one of the things that's really interesting about this environment is that there are currents that change very frequently because of the wind. Now, an oil spill anywhere is bad news, right? But it would be really bad here because it would be difficult to model where the oil is going. If it goes down towards the west, well, that means it's heading to Chicago. And if it goes down to the east, that means it's heading to Detroit. So today, this pipeline is known as Line 5, and Line 5 has not yet had an oil spill in the Straits. So why is it the source of tons of controversy? Well, in 2010, another Enbridge pipeline known as Line 6B, and if you look at the mitten of Michigan, it's that one that's going diagonally up towards the bottom. Line 6B began leaking near Marshall, Michigan, and about 840,000 gallons of diluted bitumen spread into the tributaries of the Kalamazoo River. It took about 2 days to stop the spill, and of course there were a lot of things that in retrospect Enbridge probably should have done differently. But the result was that the Marshall oil spill became one of the largest inland oil spills in recent North American history. And this didn't get on a lot of people's radars because one of the actual largest oil spills in history was happening that same summer. This was the summer of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill off the Gulf Coast shore of Louisiana. So 2010 was a really, really bad year for oil spills. Now, after the Marshall oil spill, there's a US organization called the National Wildlife Federation, and they began drawing attention to Line 5. In 2013, they used scuba divers, and they actually went down to try to document the condition of the pipelines in the Straits. And if you look at this, you can see that there's kind of like a lot of stuff on the pipeline. Well, these are mussels. There are a lot of invasive mussels in the Great Lakes. They attach themselves to anything that they can, and Enbridge has said, oh, there's no problem, everything's still good, but you can imagine that this would make inspecting the pipelines somewhat difficult. So these images come out, everyone freaks out. The state of Michigan convenes 2 statewide commissions. One was in 2015, then they had a follow-up one in 2018, and they started issuing a lot of recommendations around what to do around the pipelines. And a lot of these recommendations involved issues of information because the state didn't feel like they had enough information, people living near the pipelines didn't have enough information, people who depend on the economy of the water didn't have enough information. And so this was, I think, the big meta story of this, which is where is the information that we need about what's going on with what we can't see? But one of the most challenging aspects of information about hidden infrastructure is that it's often deliberately inaccessible to the average person because of who created it. So the federal government can tell me what pipelines are nearby, probably a little bit about what's in it, but if I want to know, well, is it transporting petroleum today and then natural gas liquids next week? The only entity that can tell me that is the company that is operating it. So the provenance, or the source of information, often determines whether we treat information as a commodity meaning something that has monetary or property value that isn't accessible to all of us, or whether it's treated as part of the commons, meaning everyone has shared and similar rights of access. So by and large, environmental information that is created by the public sector in jurisdictions with open government laws is theoretically available to the public. And I very heavily emphasize the word theoretically. There are glaring exceptions with accessing information from the public sector, particularly depending on who has political control at the moment. I know many of you in this room are familiar with some of the systematic funding and management issues of Libraries and Archives Canada. And of course, when I was preparing this, I was going back and revisiting some of the 2014 stories about the closures of federal libraries under Stephen Harper's government. But I think both of those examples are important to point out because it shows that just because information is in the public sector today doesn't mean it will be accessible in perpetuity. And of course, we know that the laws matter as well. Canada's Crown Copyright application means that far fewer of your government documents are freely available to the public compared to the United States, where the majority of our government publications are part of the public domain. But I think the distinction between public and private sector information is still crucial. And that's because if it's created by the public sector, there is a larger body of legal doctrine and precedent that supports the idea of the public's right to access public sector information. And freedom of information laws are a large part of that, but we also have things like scheduling records to ensure that they go into archives, or depository programs to identify government publications that should go into a library. And these are all methods in which we take public sector information and we move them into what you might think of as an information commons. But in contrast, the information that is created by private entities is typically treated as a commodity. It's not part of the commons. And this is because of the privileged role that private sectors are accorded within the legal systems that underpin capitalist economies. Information is treated as a company asset that may be sheltered from the public as trade secrets, confidential business information, or other forms of protection from disclosure. And the legal reasoning behind this ideology is that if you force the company to disclose all of this information, it could undercut their profits. It could provide evidence for a lawsuit to be used against a company, or it could aid a company's rivals and help them outcompete the company. So if you delve into the legal scholarship around this, you'll often find examples like, oh, this is why we have to have these laws so that Coca-Cola can keep its recipe a secret. But where things get really murky, and from my point of view, totally alarming, is that courts are really deferential to business information as a commodity, even when it has serious implications for public interest, public safety, and public health. And except for information that corporations have to share with regulators and with shareholders, they're not otherwise required to share information with the public. And of course, many corporations do share information with the public. That's not the same thing as a legal statutory right to it. So in the world of people who study this kind of stuff all the time, they call problems that arise from this an information asymmetry issue. And so this simply means that there's an asymmetrical relationship between who has information. And oftentimes in environmental scenarios, that asymmetry comes because the private sector who is doing something, in this case fossil fuel production, has more information about the impact of their activities than the regulators who are trying to oversee what they're doing. So this is why regulators do require companies to disclose a lot of information to them, but then we have a couple more issues. The first is that a regulator has to assume that any information they're getting from a company is accurate and that it's authentic, and there are lots of examples of companies not actually doing that. But then if a regulator does get that information, and that regulator is part of the public sector, that doesn't necessarily mean that I, as a member of the public, can get that information. And that's because in both Canada and the United States freedom of information laws, there are numerous exemptions for confidential business information. So if I want to understand everything that ExxonMobil has sent to the US Environmental Protection Agency, I cannot necessarily file a Freedom of Information Act request for everything that they have sent because the FOIA law has so many confidential business information exemptions in it. So there are lots of information asymmetry issues with Enbridge Line V. One of the most serious happened in 2017 when one of the state commissions said to Enbridge, they're like, you have a pipeline coating on there, right? And Enbridge was like, yeah, it's good. Well, it turned out 5 months later, it came out that Enbridge knew as far back as 2014 that there were lots of gaps in the protective coating. This word finally got back to the state. The state flipped out. They made Enbridge go back and conduct a major investigation. Information asymmetry issues also arise with the indigenous governments that have land and treaty rights around the Great Lakes region. A number of them have issued statements against Enbridge Line V. Some of them have already initiated legal action against the company. And this particular example is really interesting. This is from a government that's the Bay Mills Indian community that is in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, and they tried to meet with Enbridge to say, you know what, we want to develop an information sharing proposal. Any information that you are giving to other government officials, we need you to give it to us. So they met with Enbridge, and instead of taking this seriously, Enbridge proposed to take them on a fishing trip instead. And the tribal leadership noted that a fishing trip was not a viable alternative for the information sharing proposal that they had come to the table with. So we often are tempted to solve information asymmetry issues with technology. There is a prevailing sense that building a website or making a data set available to download is the same thing as transparency. But I think this is a problem. This is the just add technology theory of transparency. And it avoids the messy political questions of what information exists in the commons and what information has been commodified but is really of public interest. It also sidesteps questions of maintenance, such as whether there's funding and staffing allotted to ensure that any technology used in the service of transparency delivers on its promises. Now, the just add technology theory of transparency can be seen in the State of Michigan reports. And if you read these are, again, the ones that came out in 2015 and 2018 after that scuba diver video. If you read between the lines, they kind of walk right up to saying, you know what, we could pass legislative action to try to get more information out of Enbridge. That would be really hard. And I think the reason they thought it would be really hard is because there were representatives of industry on both of those state commissions. But they said, you know what, we're going to build a website, mipetroleumpipelines.com. It would be administered by a state agency through 2020, and it was going to be this ongoing source of information where there would be maps, there would be educational primers, legal guidelines, and most importantly, updates about the future of Line 5. So what's interesting is that final report that the state put out about the future of Line 5 was in December 2018. And this was the last time that the website appeared to have been updated. There are no updates about Line 5 on this official website, which is very interesting because there have been a lot of developments about Line 5 in even the last couple months. Shortly after December 2018, new state government leadership came in Michigan, including a new governor and an attorney general who had very serious questions about the future of Line 5. Now, the governor who they replaced had said, you know what, I have concerns, but we'll build a tunnel over Line 5 and it can stay in operation. And the new governor and attorney general were pretty skeptical of that. And earlier this summer, the attorney general filed a lawsuit to basically to demand the end of Line 5's operations through the Straits of Mackinac, but there's nothing about it on this official state website. So I emailed the state agency and I said, why are there no updates on the website? And I haven't gotten much of a response, and this is going to become, you'll quickly see this becomes a pattern. So then, well, okay, maybe I want to know some of what Enbridge is planning right now. So if you go to Enbridge's official, very flashy website about Line 5, they say that they want you to contact them because conversation is a two-way street. So I did. I said, I'm going to go up to Michigan soon. Would you be willing to meet with me? And if you can't meet with me, could you share any information about the future of the pipeline? So I got a response back, and I know this is probably hard to see in the back, but basically what I was told was, nice try. Some of this is confidential business information, which was exactly the response I was expecting, but I also don't really consider this kind of response to be much of a two-way street. It's more like a dead end or a cul-de-sac. So then we also have problems where bodies, especially quasi-governmental bodies, that are supposed to be operating in the public interest often do not do that. So in the United States, we have something called interstate compacts. They're similar to domestic treaties, and basically it's like a body of states that will get together and say, it's often in environmental issues, we'll do something above and beyond what the federal government requires us to do. So there's something called the Great Lakes Commission. It was formed by a compact that was created in the 1950s. And so there are 8 member states of this group, as well as Quebec and Ontario are associate members. And from their compact, they actually reserve the right of withholding their records only for representatives of the states. Even though this is a quasi-public agency, in any other state in the United States, I could file a public records request for, but I can't with the Great Lakes Commission. And so this is a body that is very influential over the health of the Great Lakes. They do water quality issues and all sorts of other things. But nothing stops me from sending an email, right? So I want to see if I can get access to the annual reports they had from the 1950s. So I email them. I say, I'm going to be up in Michigan soon. Can you let me take a look at them? And I'm told, well, there's no library here. We don't do document review. But good luck with your research. So, okay. So I did have a little bit of luck once I actually went to the State Library of Michigan. And the State Library of Michigan has existed since a 1982 law that says almost every state has a state library. It's almost like our own small versions of the Library of Congress. And so usually state libraries exist to serve the state government, but they usually also have a mandate to serve the public. And so I was going through the State Library of Michigan website. They had amazing stuff in their catalog, and I only had a couple hours to be there. So I emailed the reference librarian, and I said, is there any way that you can help me with this, because I'm only going to be there for 2 hours? I got there, and they had a whole book cart of material for me, which was awesome. It was the most productive trip I've had in a long time. And so I bring up these examples because, well, I'm sure that the people at Enbridge and the Great Lakes Commission are really nice. They probably want to be helpful. The difference between them and the state library is that only the state library is required by law to serve the public. And that was the only one where I actually got fairly useful information. And so it's ultimately political power that gets information into the hands of the public. So as we confront the challenges of accessing information around pipelines and oil production in Canada and the United States, it's worth zooming out to consider that both of these countries are Petro States. And by a Petro State, I mean a state in which the production and use of fossil fuels is so critical to its economic activity and a large share of the political elite that any suggestion to transition to non-fossil fuel resources is viewed as a threat to its way of life. Now, the energy markets between the United States and Canada are very, very closely coupled. If you look at lists right now of like who is producing the most oil and gas, both countries are usually in the top 5 and sometimes even much higher than that. Both countries supply most of their own energy needs, but when they engage in importing energy, it's typically from the other. And both the United States and Canada have very large oil and natural gas reserves. And the amount of production going up from both is increasing at the exact time that scientists tell us that we need to be going in the other direction. So Petro State ideology requires certainty that these future projections of increased production will not be altered by a concerned, outraged, or informed public, to the point where it pathologizes anyone it perceives as an enemy. It's been really fascinating to see examples of this just while I was preparing this keynote. The Alberta inquiry into these foreign sources of funding for environmental activism is wild, but we also have similar things going on in the United States. Right now, there is a bill that is probably going to be signed off by my state governor that would severely increase the criminal penalties for nonviolent pipeline protesters. So in a petro state, the logic of fossil fuel capitalism is so strong, it even allows allegedly progressive leaders to occupy remarkable heights of cognitive dissonance. Barack Obama famously bragged about speeding up oil and gas permits as part of an all-of-the-above strategy. And Justin Trudeau went to Houston and got an award from oil executives, and in his speech, he claimed no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there. So I bring up these examples to point out how deeply embedded the logic of protecting petro states' operations are, even among politicians who acknowledge the reality of climate change. The petro state is so powerful because of how it systematically hides not just infrastructure, but the information about that infrastructure. And if the information about that infrastructure and operations were more easily available to the public, that information could and would be used against it, both in a court of public opinion, but also in actual courts of law. So where does this leave librarians and archivists in the world of petro-state politics? Well, there's a number of things that we could do. I could list them on a final slide for you, but I also think that'd be a little too easy. The challenges ahead are immense, and a to-do list seems too superficial for what we have to deal with in the future. So I want us instead to consider a shift in how we view our professional identities so that we can better position ourselves for how we serve the public with the future ahead. Now, one of my eternal concerns with librarians and archivists is that we define our professional identities by the tasks that we perform for our employers, as opposed to the fundamental nature and importance of our work. We repeat things that are in our job descriptions, such as I develop retention schedules for the university, or I run checksums on the files I ingest into the digital preservation repository. But what's more rare for us is to discuss our work in a way that evokes our trade, which is that we are information workers. When we identify too closely with the specific duties of our job descriptions, we let our employers define our professional identities and therefore our professional responsibilities for us. If we identify as information workers first and foremost, that allows us to extend a very critical lens on how information is stewarded outside of the institutions that we work for. I'd like to use an example from the United States right now. In this multi-decade battle that we're in to try to get universal health care, for the first time in my life, I'm seeing healthcare workers actually enter this conversation. And this has been really transformative because healthcare workers have both the moral and the professional authority to be listened to in a way that other professions don't. And so I'd love to see something similar with information workers, where we insist on the decommodification of information. The information that is created that affects the public should be accessible to the public, even if it was information that was created by the private sector. So as librarians and archivists, all of you in this room have immense skills that you can use to deal with any environmental justice issues happening wherever you live. I deal with a lot of water issues in Cincinnati, and I'm developing this reputation where I show up at meetings with all of these things I pulled out of archives, and then I enter them into the official record of the comments from that meeting. And so if you are able to work with a library catalog or large messy data sets or data visualization, you already have some of the most prized skills that environmental justice organizations in your area could really use some help with. If your province or your state is considering changing regulations that would impede access to environmental information, you have the professional credibility and the moral authority as an information worker to organize your fellow workers and stand up against this commodification of information. And maybe if we can do this a little bit more, maybe we can eventually get a transnational group of information workers that finds a way to expropriate environmental information from the private sector. So sometimes we'll fail to get information that we need, and then we have to learn other very creative ways of getting it. A few weeks ago, I spent some time camping in Michigan near the Straits of Mackinac. And you'll recall that it's impossible to get the specific location of a pipeline because you can't zoom in too far. In fact, you can see I was at the closest zoom for pipeline views. But I was trying to figure out how close can I get to where that pipeline comes out of the water and comes onto land. And I found a lighthouse near where I was camping, so I got in my car and I headed that way. And on the way to the lighthouse, I found an Enbridge power station. Well, I drove down to the water, just over the hill, because I wanted to see if it was possible for me to see some more markers. Usually, there are these like orange kind of pipes that come up out of the ground, and they say, don't dig below here, otherwise you're gonna hit a pipeline. And so I was looking for that somewhere around the shoreline. And I found a woman who was standing at the edge, and I said to her, I'm trying to find this pipeline. You seem like you come down here a lot, 'cause she was taking a lot of photographs. And this is what it looked like at the time. There was a storm rolling in. The water is very high on the Great Lakes right now. And she said to me, yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Just look down around the edge of the shoreline. And so I was looking at that storm coming in, and I thought, this is probably a very dangerous idea. So I thought, let me get back in my car and drive back towards that power station and see what I can see. And I found what I was looking for. I found the pipeline, not because it had suddenly sprung this massive leak or there was a giant protest sign over it, but because of who was on top. When there are pipelines in the landscape, there are often these things called rights-of-way, and this is basically where an area of trees is cut away so that if someone needs to do maintenance on the pipeline, they can easily get to it. It's not uncommon for deer to browse in rights-of-way and to get food for themselves. And so I found these deer, and I thought, aha, this is probably where the pipeline is. I looked a little bit closer, and I eventually found the pipeline marker, the do not dig big post that I was looking for. So sometimes there is no way to get information about the environment because of the system that we live in that says corporations have more right to make money than our right to know what is happening with the hidden infrastructure around us. But even with this Petro State logic, there is no substitute for paying attention to the land, the air, and the water around us. And sometimes, despite the logic of commodification, the information is right in front of us, only if we know where to look. So that is my talk. Thank you so much for your invitation, and I would love to take any questions or talk more about how awesome the state of Michigan is. I swear I do not get foreign funding for the state of Michigan. Yeah, thank you.
So it looks like we have about 20 minutes for questions, and I invite those of you in the room to come to either of our two microphones that we have situated on each side of the room for questions, and we're also accepting questions online as well. So if there's somebody out there who's following along today on the live stream, I'm sure there are many of you, you can ask questions as well. Thank you so much, Eira, for that very timely talk. And don't all fall over yourselves as you're running to the mics. And I am going to give you a bit of time to formulate your questions. Great.
Hi. Thank you. That was a really good talk. My question is about what you think librarians or archivists can do to address environmental research literacy. So once you free the information, how do you address the public's digestion of it?
I think I got that, but actually I was going to ask you to clarify something. Could you give me like a specific example that you might be thinking of?
Sure. So I used to work for Alberta Innovates, which is a research funding organization, and part of my job was to get that research out to the public. But a lot of the times the research is in these long 100-page reports, very scientific, like not your average person can really understand what it's about. So what would be your suggestion to helping the public to understand that information more?
That is such a good question, and I have to say this is something that I've struggled with myself, because so my background is in, my pre-library background is in geography, but I was more of a human geographer than a physical geographer, and so I am much better equipped to read things about like demographics than about, glacial hydrology, right? And so it's hard for me to say whether this is an issue for librarians and archivists to push on or solve, because some of this comes from the scientific community itself, right? And I think to the scientific community's credit, particularly with scientists who deal with climate change, there's a lot of realization that, like, wow, people don't know, like, if you hit someone with an 800-page report, that is really hard for people to digest and understand. So there's, I think, a movement within science to try to figure out how that gets translated to something that people can understand. But I also think sometimes people can understand more than we give them credit for. And I think that's where librarians and archivists come in, which is just to really be part of our community, right? And be part of our community, be involved with the environmental issues happening around us. Because I'll have people come to me and they'll say, how do I find out, like, who is polluting in my neighborhood? And then I will say, well, here's how the Environmental Protection Agency regulates this. There are these things called, discharge permits. I can't even remember the acronym right now. And I think this isn't really a great answer to your question, but I think being part of that research process ourselves and understanding if we have trouble with it as librarians and archivists, then what does the general public encounter? And I think that gives us really a very empathetic lens to be able to say to the public, hey, here is how you translate this, right? You probably the answer you're looking for is like in the first 5 pages or the last 3 pages of an environmental report, and you don't have to read the 700 in between to understand what's going on.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Now's your opportunity.
I can ask a question of the
Oh,
audience.
we have a question coming. Peter, thank you. And then you can save your question of the audience.
Hi. I really I'm really interested in the way you talk from local examples, and you took us right into that forest and showed us the deer. Do you think that is where the strength is that can drive this, or can we get stuck there and not make it up to challenge things at the provincial and national levels?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question about. I don't think so. It's very clear to me that this is a fight, right? This is a battle that we're in, and you can't fight for what you don't love. And so, I don't live in Michigan, but I have tons of family in Michigan, and so even though this is not my watershed, it is my family's watershed. Even though, and that's why I just drew on that example of I go to these things about local water issues in my community because you can't fight for what you don't love. And people tend to love what is closest to them and what they really would feel a serious loss for. And I think there's a really interesting conversation happening within the larger climate change community around, historically, and this actually goes back to the question about long scientific reports, right? Where I think for a long time, climate scientists especially felt like they had to talk about things in a very detached way because otherwise it would be, they wouldn't be objective, it would be unprofessional. But I wrote this and I have been dealing with climate change issues in my work for several years now. And so I'm usually pretty good about managing my own emotions. And writing this triggered some seriously dark feelings in me because I was just I was reading a lot of Albertan oil and gas industry producer reports, and that was some dark stuff. They're gonna keep producing because they're gonna figure out carbon sequestration, and so oil and gas as part of the climate change solution is an actual phrase people say, and I think the way I have personally seen people get activated on this issue is because of a local connection, right? It's like the hidden infrastructure issue. We don't think about what we can't see. Something happening somewhere halfway around the world is probably terrible, but it doesn't activate us in the way that something happening near where we live does. And so I think to answer your question, the trick is, yes, people get activated on the local level, and that's a starting point, because even though I had this case study of a pipeline in the Great Lakes, the reality is there are versions of this happening all over North America, in the world right now, right? Pipelines going by bodies of water. And so I think people get activated on things local to them, but then they realize, oh, wow, this is happening in many, 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 many other places in my state, in my province, in my country, in my bioregion. And that's when you really see people beginning to link up their local concerns, and I think that is what really makes progress on these things.
Thank you.
Looks like we're having another question over.
Good.
So, I'm Doug Carriel. I'm with Athabasca University Library in Athabasca, Alberta. I just want to step back from you gave a great example about hidden infrastructure, but there's lots of hidden infrastructure. Like, even in our small town, anybody who has a development permit and it gets put in the paper, and people who have, quote, a direct interest in this particular development permit have an opportunity to come to council and make information and make a presentation about their concerns. If you live halfway across town and you maybe have an interest in this particular item, you can't do it because you're not, quote, directly affected by the thing. That's in your local town. That happens on county level, happens on a provincial level. Any of these kinds of things, you get notices about various environmental or various developmental, various different kinds of things that are activities that are happening. And unless you are, quote, directly affected, which they seem to define as someone who is actually right there in part, and they don't think about the fact that maybe we have an interest because we happen to live in the area or the watershed or whatever it is. Then no. So that is happening now. You're suggesting that, if I understand it correctly, you're suggesting that we as informational professionals, librarians, archivists, whatever, should be able to have more access to that material and some of that information, that background information, some of what is happening. How do you suggest that we actually start getting that information or encouraging government to provide access to that information to the wider public so that we as where it can be put in maybe a repository or some kind of place that's more readily accessible rather than just going down to the city hall or town hall or the provincial government location that you can, and that's the only place where you can see it. How do you suggest that we actually get and gain access and then make it available?
Sure. Well, I think that, again, going back to local contexts, right? You kind of would almost need to know the local landscape of how you do politics where you live, right? Because this is ultimately a political question. Enbridge or other companies or even governments that are very hostile to concerns of regular members of the public are not going to willingly just give over this information if you ask nicely enough. You could see that from all of the examples of the emails I put up. And so I think this really calls for, this is a collective action problem. So it requires a collective action solution, which means working with other people to say, well, how in our area, like what are the examples in whatever jurisdiction you're talking about that people have successfully worked together to change the conditions of where they live. And then we deal with the exact same thing that we were just talking about in the Ohio River watershed, where they keep having all these meetings about deregulating pollution control standards. They have one meeting that most people can't get to. And so what happened with us was a bunch of us would show up at the meetings and say, you need to have multiple meetings, period. And like every single person got up in the mic, said that, a journalist covered it, and then they were shamed into having multiple meetings, whereas before they just had one. And I think part of that was because over time, all of us who had been going to these meetings together kind of got together and said, what is our, like, when we're all up at the mic, what do we want to say together? So it was just like one person after another saying this. And so that worked for us. That might not work in other contexts, right? And so I think this is why it's so important for people who care about environmental information to look at what's happening with other social justice issues in other contexts, which is like, there are blueprints to victory and winning things, but we need to know the history of how other groups have done that. And then we can learn a lot from them and use that collectively to try to work politically together to make some of these changes. But yeah, if we can even achieve like 1/10 of what I proposed in my lifetime, that would be a massive victory, because it's probably going to take that long to get any changes.
Hi, I'm Natasha from U of A. So one of the things that's really big here in Alberta, and I'm sure in the States as well, is the sort of idea that we have to give these companies the freedom, the tax breaks, because we need it for our jobs. Yes. And I think that as public sector workers, the people in the real world often kind of say, well, you have your job, we need our jobs, and so don't be fighting against these companies. So I just wonder how to kind of work against that, if you have any ideas on how to respond to that.
I'm so glad that you asked that question, because I was hoping someone would ask a question like this. In the part of Ohio that I live in is very close to Appalachia, and this was the historical home of coal mining, right? And so you'll see this thing on a lot of truck and car bumper stickers, and it says Friends of Coal, right? And it's this idea that like, oh, there are all of these enemies that are trying to like, get rid of coal mining jobs. And it's interesting because this is funded by the industry, right? Like the United Mine Workers, which was historically like one of the most important unions in American history in fighting for the rights of miners, the Friends of Coal industry groups hate coal miners because they've been so hostile to the United Mine Workers. And yet it is sort of, over time, they have been able to do, I think some of what I see from just reading about some of the things here in Alberta, it's like the exact same rhetoric, right? It's the exact same, like, you obviously hate workers, all of you, elites working in the academy, and you don't know what it's like to actually work a real job. And I will say, yes, it is very hard, and I think that is why you always have to, this is why you always have to take, in my book, you always have to take a pro-worker stance. And you always have to turn it back on the industry and say, well, why is the industry preventing renewable energy, which in many jurisdictions pays way more money and is way less dangerous than oil and gas extraction? Why is the industry preventing workers from getting good jobs, right? And this is why I think in the United States, we finally have, not enough, but we finally have a couple of politicians who I think understand that talking about decent jobs is one of the ways to break this logjam. And this is what is at the heart of this idea of the Green New Deal that is being propelled by politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where it's like, unless you offer people like an alternative to feed their family, because we still live in capitalism, right? People are, obviously they're gonna, obviously they're going to take whatever job feeds their family. Like, I'm not going to blame a worker for that, but I do blame the industry, right? And I blame industry for like restricting our options. So for me, this is always why when I talk about this, I keep the focus on industry, and I keep the focus on CEOs that have like 1 million houses, not just someone who's taking a job in order to feed their family. But it's a good question, and I think it's something we always need to keep front of mind.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if there was one. And we do have one.
Hello, I'm Frederic Giuliano from McGill University in Montreal. Just a quick question. I'm thinking about your slide saying something like, information workers of the world, unite. Who do you think should lead that union? Do you think it should be led by professional organizations of librarians or archivists? Who should take that leadership, you think?
The workers themselves. I mean, like, I come from a set of politics that I think institutions are necessary, but I have a great deal of skepticism about institutions to always represent the interests of workers. And I think that we have seen in the United States some examples of when professional associations, like the American Library Association, does not always represent the interests of workers. And I think that's why this is why I keep emphasizing the word workers, not information institutions, but workers. And I think workers have to be the ones to set this agenda. And, these are transnational issues. So I love the idea of doing more transnational work across borders.
Okay, thank you again, Eira. This talk was definitely inspiring, enlightening, and you could really see how you explored the local context, and we really appreciate the work that you put into your talk today.